It was supposed to be the happiest night of our family's life, the one we'd remember forever. But standing under the blinding lights of the Lakeshore Grand, I realized I was just a prop in someone else's performance. The orchestra's swelled laughter bounced off crystal chandeliers, and the smell of expensive champagne filled the air. My sister's $100,000 wedding had finally begun, 200 guest cameras flashing a parade of smiles that felt rehearsed. I'd spent months building this night, managing the chaos, fixing every detail my parents forgot. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd see me this time, not as the problem solver, not as the shadow behind their golden child, but as their daughter. When my father took the stage to give his toast, I stood near the back, my heart pounding with pride. Then his voice echoed through the ballroom, smooth and confident, every word sharp enough to cut through the music. "We're so proud of our only daughter." The crowd cheered. My mother's hand found his, and they smiled like royalty. I couldn't move. The words kept ringing in my ears. Only daughter. Guests turned to look at me, confusion flickering, pity forming. Somewhere between the applause and the flash of a camera, I felt myself vanish. That was the moment I understood. Tonight wasn't about love or family. It was about erasing me in front of everyone who mattered, and they thought I would stay silent. The ballroom at the Lakeshore Grand shimmered under 1,000 chandeliers, every crystal catching the gold light like a promise no one planned to keep. The band was already deep into a Sinatra classic, the kind my father loved to hum when business was good. Tonight everything looked perfect. It was supposed to be perfect. My sister's wedding, the event of the year, a $100,000 celebration in downtown Chicago. 200 guests, most of them people my parents wanted to impress. I had spent months planning it, negotiating contracts, smoothing over caterers, booking the florist who only worked with celebrity clients. My credit card had carried more of this wedding than anyone cared to know. I told myself it was worth it, that maybe this would finally be the night my parents saw me, not just as the responsible one who fixed their messes, but as their daughter again. When the MC called for my father to give a toast, I stood near the back, half hidden behind the last table of guests. He took the microphone with his usual charm, his tux pressed, his glass raised high. My mother stood beside him, pearls glowing under the lights, one hand resting on his arm. "We're so proud of our only daughter," he said, voice warm and full of champagne. The crowd erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. My sister Lily smiled up at them from the head table, radiant in her silk gown. For a moment I thought I'd misheard him. Only daughter. The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Then my mother leaned into the microphone and added, "She's made this family so proud." The applause doubled. Something inside me went still. Around me people clapped and toasted. A guest at the next table glanced my way and whispered, "Is she the planner?" Another nodded. "Must be. She looks exhausted." I turned away before they could see my face. My hands trembled as I set down my half-empty glass. The laughter from the stage blurred into the music. I walked toward the exit heels, clicking against marble, the sound swallowed by the orchestra. Outside on the terrace, the winter air hit me sharp and clean. The lake stretched out below, dark and endless lights from the city flickering on its surface. I kicked off my shoes and let the cold stones seep through my bare feet. From inside, cheers erupted again. Fireworks burst above the skyline, gold and white streaks exploding against the black. My sister's laughter echoed through the open doors, the kind that always sounded rehearsed. I pulled my phone from my clutch, more out of habit than purpose. A notification blinked. An old work email automatically forwarded from an account I hadn't used in years. Subject line: property transfer, 118 Orchard Drive, beneficiary Lily Walker. For a second I didn't understand what I was looking at. Orchard Drive. That was our old house in Evanston, the one my grandparents built, the one my parents swore would stay in the family forever. My thumb scrolled through the message. There it was. A finalized deed notarized last week, signed by both my parents. The house, the only thing in this world that felt like home, had been transferred entirely to Lily. My stomach turned cold. They hadn't just erased me with words. They'd done it on paper too. I stared at the lake until the fireworks faded. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of burnt sugar from the dessert bar inside. Somewhere behind the glass walls, people were still clapping, still smiling. My mother's voice drifted out through the speakers, thanking everyone for coming. I remembered something my grandmother once told me when I was 12 and too serious for my age. Family secrets, she'd said, are always written down somewhere. You just have to find the right drawer. I slipped my phone back into my clutch, took a deep breath, and looked through the glass. My parents were still on stage posing for photos with Lily and her new husband. Their faces glowed with pride, framed by all the light I would never stand under. I turned away from the ballroom from the sound of their applause. The cold air felt like a baptism cutting through the fog in my head. Somewhere inside me, something small and steady began to harden. They wanted me invisible. Tonight they succeeded. But as the last firework faded into the dark, I made myself a quiet promise. If they could erase me, once I would make sure they never did it again. The drive home that night felt endless. The city lights faded behind me, swallowed by the black stretch of highway. My phone buzzed a dozen times in my bag messages from colleagues, a few friends wishing me a happy new year, none of them aware that my entire world had just collapsed under the weight of applause. I didn't answer. The farther I drove, the quieter everything became, until the only sound was the hum of the tires and the echo of my father's voice, saying those 3 words that had erased me. When I finally reached my apartment in Chicago, the air inside was stale and cold. I dropped my clutch on the kitchen counter, kicked off my shoes, and sat in the dark. The email still glowed on my phone screen. The more I stared at it, the less real it felt. My parents had always cared about appearances, but this was deliberate. It wasn't just about money. It was about rewriting the story of our family. I thought back to the years that had led us here, the quiet ones no one ever talked about. When I was a kid in Evanston, my father ran a small furniture business called Grant Woodcraft. I used to sit in the workshop after school covered in sawdust, handing him nails while he built tables for neighbors. My sister Lily, 3 years younger, never liked the smell of varnish. She was the kind who performed in the living room singing off-key to an audience of our mother's friends, and somehow everyone adored her for it. My parents said she brought light into every room. They said I brought order. I learned early that light got love and order got responsibility. By the time I turned 25, I was managing the company's finances while working full-time at an accounting firm in the city. My father still called it a family business, though I was the one balancing the books at midnight. Lily had gone into marketing and spent most of her time posting glossy photos of grand interiors as she rebranded it online. Clients loved the story of the visionary daughter modernizing her father's legacy. I didn't correct it. I told myself family comes first, that one day the truth would matter. In 2015, everything fell apart. A failed expansion, a lawsuit, unpaid taxes. My father called me one night, voice trembling in a way I had never heard before. He said, "We could lose the house." I had just been promoted at work. I had savings plans, the first real sense of security I'd ever known. Without thinking, I liquidated part of my stock portfolio and transferred $120,000 into his account. I told him it was a loan, but I never expected it back. 3 months later, an article appeared in a local design magazine. Lily Grant, the young entrepreneur who saved her family's company. My parents framed the article and hung it in the hallway. I remember staring at it during Thanksgiving, my reflection caught between Lily's smile and the headline that gave her my story. My mother noticed me looking and said, "Family is about perception, Emily, not facts. People believe what they see." That line stuck with me, maybe because she believed it so deeply. Everything with her was about presentation. The perfect dinner parties, the curated smiles, the illusion that we were a family untouched by cracks. I didn't realize then that she wasn't just protecting our image, she was rewriting our history. In 2018, my father's health began to fail. He had a mild heart attack, and the doctor told him to rest. My mother panicked. She said the company needed someone to manage the finances while he recovered. I was already doing it unofficially, but she insisted on formal paperwork just in case. She brought me a folder to sign while I was visiting him in the hospital. "It's temporary," she said. "Power of attorney. Only for bills." I signed without reading every page. I trusted her. I didn't know that piece of paper would become the tool they used to erase me later. After he recovered, my mother quietly took over the business. I noticed small things at first, my name disappearing from tax forms, certain accounts I could no longer access. When I asked, she brushed it off as streamlining. My father avoided eye contact. He looked tired, older than his years, like someone trying to hold together a picture frame with missing glass. I convinced myself they'd fix it. They always said family fixes itself. Then came Lily's engagement in 2022, the kind of headline wedding every socialite in Chicago dreamed of. My parents poured everything into it, selling part of the business to her fiancé's family, a wealthy real estate developer. They said it was a merger of futures. I should have seen the warning signs. Then new contracts with names I didn't recognize. Documents disappearing from the office, my mother's tone when she said, "It's time to think about legacy." Legacy. That word used to mean something comforting. Now it felt like a verdict. Sitting in my dark apartment after the wedding, I thought about the night my grandmother died years ago. She'd called me into her room, her voice faint but steady. "Emily," she'd said, "whatever you do, keep copies of everything. They'll call it family, but it's business." I hadn't understood what she meant then. I did now. I opened my laptop, pulled up old folders, bank records, contracts. My name had vanished from more than just one property. Every asset I had helped rebuild was tied to my parents or Lily. It was like watching a magician's trick in reverse. The girl disappears, and everyone applauds. The city outside my window was quiet. The fireworks had long stopped. I could see my reflection in the glass, pale and determined. I wasn't crying anymore. They had built a life on my silence, on the belief that I would always be the responsible one, the quiet helper who never demanded recognition. But silence is a habit, not a destiny. And habits can be broken. The next morning, the sky over Lake Michigan was gray and heavy. I sat at my desk with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at the deed from the email. The signature was my father's, but the paperwork had my mother's precision. It was all legal, every loophole sealed. Still, something told me there was more. The way my grandmother's trust had been managed, the missing documents, the timing of that transfer. None of it happened by accident. Somewhere buried in those files was the proof of what they'd done. I didn't know yet how deep it went, or how far I'd have to dig, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. They had written me out of the story. Now I was going to write myself back in. The next morning I woke up with a decision already made. The city felt smaller somehow, suffocating, like every window carried someone else's reflection, but not mine. I packed an overnight bag, tossed my laptop inside, and started the 3-hour drive north toward Evanston. The house on Orchard Drive waited at the edge of town like a ghost, the same one I had saved years ago from foreclosure, the one that now belonged to someone else. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the late afternoon sun had started to dip behind the trees. The curtains were open, and the warm glow from the living room spilled across the lawn. I could hear laughter through the windows, the clinking of glasses. For a second, I thought about turning back. But then I saw the silver SUV parked in front Lily's new husband's car, and something inside me hardened again. When I stepped through the front door, the air smelled of perfume and champagne. My mother was sitting on the couch, carefully unwrapping wedding gifts, while my father leaned back in his chair, smiling at something she said. The sound of their laughter stopped the second they saw me. My mother's face didn't change much. She simply set the box in her lap aside and said calmly, "Emily, I didn't expect you." I stood near the doorway, still holding my coat. The words came out before I could stop them. I didn't expect to be erased either. My father cleared his throat. He looked older, tired. "Emily, this isn't the time." I stepped forward, dropping the printed copy of the property deed on the coffee table. "I think it's exactly the time. You used my account, my trust, my money, and then handed this house over like a wedding favor." My mother reached for the paper but stopped halfway. "Lily needs stability," she said, her tone practiced. You have your own career, your independence. You're stronger than she is. Stronger, I repeated, trying to steady my voice. That's what you call it. I call it convenient. My father shifted uncomfortably, his hand gripping the armrest. We did what was practical, he murmured. I looked at him for a long moment. Practical. You sold me out for appearances. The staircase creaked and Lily appeared at the top, her hair still styled from the night before, a soft pink robe draped over her shoulders. Her diamond ring caught the light as she came down, eyes red. Emily, please, I didn't know. Adam said the paperwork was just a formality, that Mom and Dad wanted it that way for taxes. I turned the papers toward her, pointing to her signature. You signed this. Don't tell me you didn't know what it meant. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't move. I remembered when she was 10 crying over a broken bracelet, and I had fixed it for her while our parents praised her for being sweet. She still had that same look now, a kind of guilt that never reached her spine. My mother stood smoothing her blouse as if preparing for a meeting. You've always been too independent, Emily. You never needed us. We assumed you'd be fine. I laughed softly, though it sounded closer to a gasp. You didn't assume I'd be fine. You made sure I couldn't be anything else. My father tried again. This family doesn't need another scene. I stared at him, the man who once taught me to hold a hammer steady, who said integrity mattered more than profit. Somewhere along the line, he'd traded that lesson for silence. I took a step back, the room spinning slightly, with the smell of their new candles and polished wood. All those years I spent saving what they built, and this is what they left me. Not even a name on a mailbox. My mother crossed her arms. You're being dramatic. You don't understand how complicated these things are. Complicated, I said quietly. It's simple, actually. You decided which daughter looked better in a headline. No one spoke. The air felt heavy, thick with things we'd never said. In the corner, a clock ticked too loud, marking every second of a life I didn't recognize anymore. I grabbed the folder from the table and turned toward the door. You can keep the house, I said. Just remember who paid for the foundation when it was collapsing. Lily's voice followed me to the hallway. Emily, please don't do this. I paused, looking back at her. You already did. Outside, the evening air was cool and sharp, smelling of wet leaves and cold pavement. The porch light flickered above me. I stood there for a moment, trying to breathe, trying not to crumble. That's when my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I have proof about the loans. DS. For a second I didn't move. Then I read it again. Proof. Loans. Someone out there knew something. I looked back at the house, its windows glowing warm and safe, like a lie that had been rehearsed too long. Somewhere inside, I could still hear the faint sound of my mother's voice, calm, unbothered. I turned away, walking toward my car, the gravel crunching under my heels. The night felt different this time, not empty, but waiting. The wind off the lake carried a chill that raised the hair on my arms. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was fate. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. Whoever DS was, they had opened a door my family thought they'd locked forever. As I started the engine, my reflection caught in the rearview mirror. My face looked the same, but my eyes didn't. Something had shifted. I backed out of the driveway, the house shrinking in the mirror, until it was just another shape in the dark. The text glowed on my screen beside me, one message, one promise of truth. The fight had already begun. The name on the text stayed on my screen the whole drive back to the city. DS. I kept repeating it in my head like an equation I couldn't solve. Whoever they were, they knew something about the loans, and loans were the one part of my family's empire I had never been allowed to touch. The next morning, I received another message. Meet me tomorrow, 10 a.m. Harbor Cafe near South Station. Bring nothing but questions. DS. I didn't sleep that night. My mind kept circling through possibilities. A journalist, a scam, or someone from the bank who finally grew a conscience. By morning, I had convinced myself it didn't matter. If this person had answers, I needed them. The cafe was small, the kind of place where people came to disappear behind laptops and burnt espresso. It smelled of rain and roasted beans. A man was already sitting at the back table, mid-30s, clean-shaven, a dark gray coat folded beside him. When I walked in, he stood immediately. Emily Wright. His voice was low, cautious. David Sullivan. I recognized the name instantly. He had worked at Chicago Trust Bank years ago, the same institution that managed my parents' accounts. "You worked with my family," I said, sliding into the chair across from him. "Worked" is the key word, he said, offering a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I quit when I realized what they were doing." He opened a leather folder and pulled out a thin stack of papers. I thought I knew what I was about to see. I didn't. "This," he said, tapping the first page, "is a loan agreement from 2018. $180,000 transferred from Grant Interiors to the bank to settle a property lien on 118 Orchard Drive. But the account that paid that sum didn't belong to Grant Interiors. It belonged to you." I frowned. "That's not possible. I never approved that transaction." He nodded slowly. "I know. That's the problem." He handed me another page, a printed confirmation. The sender's name read Emily Grant. The signature below looked like mine, down to the looping G. "It's a perfect copy," he said. "Electronic forgery. Whoever did this had access to your digital records. They used your funds to pay off the debt, then transferred the deed to your sister. On paper, it looks like you gifted the house to her." My pulse hammered in my ears. "So legally, the house is hers." "For now," he said. But what they did was fraud, financial and personal. I stared at the rows of numbers, the clean precision of it all. Every line item was an accusation written in ink. My savings, my trust account, all drained into a transaction I never authorized. He turned another page, showing me an email header. "This was sent from your old work address, months after you left the firm. It confirms you voluntarily withdrew from your grandmother's trust." I looked closer. The email domain was mine, but the server data listed an IP address registered to my parents' home office. My throat went dry. "My mother." David leaned back. "I've seen a lot of messy families, but this one's creative." I let out a shaky breath. "So if I sue, what happens?" "You can win," he said without hesitation. "But be ready. They'll hit back first. Your reputation, your job, anything they can twist. You're the scapegoat now. That's how these people survive." I stared down at the table. A drop of coffee had pooled beside my hand, reflecting the light like a small mirror. In that tiny reflection, I barely recognized myself. "I've already lost my reputation," I said quietly. "What's left to lose?" He didn't smile, just nodded once, as if he'd heard that answer before, from other people who had finally reached their breaking point. We spent the next hour going through the evidence. He explained how the bank's internal system logged every transaction, how even deleted files could be retrieved through subpoena. His calm precision made it all sound doable, almost procedural, but the weight behind every word reminded me of how deep the damage went. When we finished, he gathered the papers back into his folder. "I'll start a preliminary case review," he said. "If we find enough to prove financial misconduct, we move to civil court." I hesitated, then asked the question that had been pressing against my chest. "Why help me?" He studied me for a moment before answering. "Let's just say I've seen what happens when families like yours get away with things. I couldn't live with it again." Outside, the sky had turned the color of steel. The street was slick from rain, cars rushing past in a blur of sound and water. I stood under the cafe awning, clutching the folder he'd given me. For the first time since the wedding, I didn't feel invisible. I felt dangerous. As I started to walk back toward my car, the world felt strangely sharp, alive. The hum of traffic, the smell of wet pavement, even the cold wind against my face, it all carried a sense of purpose. My phone buzzed again. A new message from David. "We'll need to move fast. Someone inside the family already knows I contacted you." I froze on the sidewalk, the rain falling harder now, drumming against the folder in my hands. Through the fogged glass of a passing taxi, I thought I saw a familiar figure watching from across the street. But when I blinked, they were gone. I tucked the papers under my coat and kept walking. The war my parents had started years ago, the quiet one fought with contracts and signatures, was no longer silent. And this time, I was ready to fight back. The next few days blurred into a rhythm of calls, emails, and silence. David and I met almost every morning, trading updates over cheap diner coffee and late-night phone calls. Each document we found felt like a brick pulled from the wall my family had built around their lies. On Thursday, we drove to the old Grant Interiors office on the west side of the city. The sign out front had been replaced with polished silver letters, Lawrence and Grant Design. The building looked the same, but everything inside felt foreign, stripped of its history. Lily's husband, Adam Lawrence, had turned it into a showroom of wealth glass walls, art prints, a receptionist who smiled without warmth. We asked to see Edith Bowman, the company's longtime accountant. The receptionist hesitated but made a call. Minutes later, Edith appeared at the end of the hallway, short and tired-looking, her eyes flicking nervously toward the security camera above the door. She led us into a small side office. Once the door closed, she exhaled. "I don't have long. Adam's assistant watches everything." She pulled a folder from her tote and handed it to me. Inside was a series of bank statements and transaction memos, a $50,000 transfer from the corporate account to a private checking account under Lily's name. The note beside it read, "Wedding bonus." My chest tightened. That money came from the same fund I'd replenished years ago when the company was failing. My parents had drained what I'd built to finance her party. David leaned over my shoulder, scanning the pages. He pointed at another line. Consulting fee, $15,000. Recipient Victor Langley. "Who's Langley?" I asked. "Notary public," he said quietly. "The one who certified your property transfer." "So they paid him." He nodded, enough to look the other way. The room felt suddenly smaller, the fluorescent light too bright. Edith wiped her palms on her skirt. "I shouldn't be showing you this," she said. "But I've worked here 30 years. I know the difference between a mistake and a scheme. And this is a scheme." Before we left, she pressed a flash drive into David's hand. "Backup copies. If they find out I never met you." Outside, the air smelled like rain. David walked beside me in silence until we reached the car. I asked what happens next. "We request an audit," he said. "I'll file a subpoena for Langley's records. Once the paper trail's official, they can't bury it." I looked back at the building, its windows gleaming in the gray light. My name used to be on that wall. Now it was just decoration for someone else's legacy. That night I couldn't sleep. The apartment felt too quiet. I poured myself a glass of wine and opened the file Edith had given us. Every transaction was precise, deliberate, like a crime committed by someone who thought they'd never be caught. When the clock struck midnight, I found myself staring at an old photo on my bookshelf, me and my grandmother Eleanor standing in front of the house on Orchard Drive. Her handwriting on the back read, "For Emily who builds not destroys." I remembered the stories she used to tell about her trust fund, how she'd set it up so her granddaughters would always have something of their own. After her death, my mother had said the trust was dissolved, that Eleanor wanted everything merged into the company. I'd believed her. Now I wasn't so sure. The next morning, David called. "We got confirmation," he said. "Langley deposited the $15,000 into a shell account tied to Lawrence Holdings." "So they bought a signature," I said. "And they used it to steal your inheritance." I went quiet. Then I asked, "If they can buy the law, how do we fight them?" He paused. "By making the truth louder than their money." Later that afternoon, I drove to my grandmother's old house in Wilmette, now empty and up for sale. The library still smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The shelves were half bare, but in the corner behind a loose panel, I found a locked metal box. The key had long been lost, but the hinges were weak. I pried it open with the screwdriver from the kitchen drawer. Inside were folders stamped with a familiar crest, Eleanor Trust. My hands shook as I opened them. There were account summaries, handwritten notes, and a letter addressed to my mother, dated 2 weeks before my grandmother's death. The first line made my throat tighten. "If you are reading this, Evelyn, It means I am gone. Do not touch the trust. It belongs to Emily. I sank to the floor, the papers scattered around me. My grandmother had known. She had tried to protect me. I called David immediately, my voice barely steady. I found it. Proof of the trust. Proof she warned my mother. He told me to lock everything up and bring it to his office in the morning. When I hung up, the sun was setting through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the room. The box sat open beside me, a silent monument to every lie my family had built. For years I thought I was fighting for a house or a company, but this wasn't about property anymore. It was about erasure, about the right to exist in my own story. I closed the box and stood up, my reflection faint in the window pane. The fight wasn't just legal, now it was personal, ancient, written in blood and signatures. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one. I tucked the folder under my arm and whispered to the empty room, "You should have kept your promise, Grandma. I'll keep mine." Tomorrow the truth would finally have a voice. The storm didn't wait until morning. By the time I reached home, thunder rolled over the lake, shaking the windows of my apartment. I placed the box from my grandmother on the dining table and called David. He answered on the second ring, his voice tight. "Langley just sent me a message," he said. His tone was clipped, controlled. "He knows we're digging into his financial records." What kind of message? Drop this or lose everything? I pressed my hand against the cold glass of the window, watching the rain blur the city lights. "He won't touch us," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Be careful anyway," David warned. "Back up your files, change your passwords. This man works for people who don't play fair." I hung up and opened my laptop. Within minutes, I realized something was wrong. My inbox kept refreshing itself. Folders disappeared one by one, and a notification appeared on the corner of the screen, "Unauthorized access detected." Then the power flickered and went out. For a long moment, the only light came from the storm flashing outside. I could hear my own heartbeat. I shut the laptop, grabbed the box from the table, and locked it in the closet. The next morning, I filed a police report. The officer was polite but skeptical, treating it like an ordinary case of online theft. He took notes and handed me a card. "If it escalates, call this number." "It already has," I muttered. When I returned to my car, there was a plain white envelope tucked under the wiper. Inside were 2 photographs, me leaving David's office the day before and standing in front of my apartment door. The words "Stop now" were written in thick black ink across the bottom. I felt the air drain from my lungs. Someone had followed me close enough to capture every detail. That evening, I called David again. He told me to come to his office and bring the trust papers, but something in his voice made me hesitate. Fear, maybe? Or guilt. I told him I needed one more night to organize everything. I couldn't sleep. The city seemed to hum with something just beyond hearing. Around midnight, I drove north back to Evanston, back to the house on Orchard Drive. The one I'd sworn never to enter again. The key still fit the back door. Inside, the air was cold and stale dust floating through the narrow beam of my flashlight. The house was empty now, staged for sale, but the bones of it were the same. The creak of the stairs, the faint scent of cedar from my father's old study. I climbed to the attic, remembering the way my grandmother's voice had echoed up those stairs when I was little. "Everything that matters is written down," she used to say. I found the old wooden chest behind a stack of broken furniture. It was heavier than I remembered. When I opened it, the hinges screamed. Inside were ledgers, sealed envelopes, and one large envelope labeled "Last Will and Testament. Eleanor Grant." My hands shook as I opened it. The handwriting was my grandmother's, neat and deliberate. It listed the trust in my name, the property rights, and the contingency clause. Any alteration without the beneficiary's consent would be invalid. My mother had known this existed. She had changed the copy anyway. I sat on the dusty floor reading by the weak light of my phone. The truth filled me with equal parts relief and rage. My entire childhood she had spoken of legacy and loyalty, and now I could see what those words had really meant. Control. The phone rang, jolting me. It was her. For a moment, I thought about letting it go to voicemail, but something in me wanted to hear her voice. I answered. "Emily," she said softly, the same tone she used when I was a child caught doing something wrong. "If you stop this, we can fix it. We can still be a family." I almost laughed. "We were never a family," I said. "Just a business with shared blood." There was silence on the other end. Then her voice turned cold. "You think this will make you happy? You'll destroy everything we built." "You already did," I said and hung up. For a while I just sat there listening to the rain hammering against the roof. Then I took photos of every page of the will, scanned them with my phone, and emailed the files to David. My laptop might have been compromised, but this time I used a different device, one they couldn't track. A few minutes later, David replied, "Got it. This changes everything. Bring the originals in the morning." I placed the documents back into the chest, then pulled an old quilt from a nearby trunk and covered it. Outside, lightning flared through the cracks of the attic window. The wind howled, shaking the glass. Standing there, surrounded by my grandmother's memories, I realized this wasn't just about proving fraud anymore. It was about reclaiming the truth she'd tried to preserve for me. I whispered into the dark, "I found it, Grandma. I finally found it." When I stepped outside, the storm had turned violent. Branches bent under the wind, rain slashed against my face. I ran to the car, clutching the phone in my pocket like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Before I started the engine, I looked back at the house one last time. The windows flashed white from the lightning, and for a brief second I thought I saw a figure standing behind the curtain, watching, waiting. Maybe it was just my reflection, or maybe not. Either way, by morning, the storm would pass. And when it did, the real battle would begin. By morning, the storm had broken into a calm gray drizzle. It felt like the world had exhaled, but inside me the pressure hadn't eased. 6 months had passed since that night, months of subpoenas, depositions, and whispered threats. Every day had felt like wading through mud. But now, finally, we were here, the first day of Grant v. Grant. The courthouse in downtown Chicago was surrounded by cameras. Reporters shouted my name as David and I walked through the front steps. He kept his head down, his hand steady on my shoulder, a small gesture that said, "Keep walking." The marble floors inside gleamed under the lights, too clean, too bright. I could see our reflections, two ghosts dragging truth into daylight. Across the aisle, my mother sat beside her lawyer in a pale blue suit, her hair perfectly styled, her expression calm and saintly. Adam sat next to her, avoiding my eyes, his cufflinks glinting like small weapons. My father was further down the bench, quiet, smaller than I remembered, eyes fixed on the floor. When the judge entered the room, hushed. The case began with the financial evidence, wire transfers, forged signatures, missing trust records. I listened to my name being read aloud like a list of charges instead of crimes against me. Halfway through the proceedings, Evelyn's lawyer stood and presented a USB drive. He said they had new evidence proving I'd embezzled company funds. My stomach tightened. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the screen flickered on. The video showed me sitting at a desk, typing into a company account. The camera angle was grainy, but clear enough to see my face. Numbers appeared on the screen, large transactions moving into a personal account under my name. The murmurs began instantly. Evelyn's lawyer turned to the judge. "This, Your Honor, is a direct recording from Grant Interior's internal system proving that Ms. Grant misappropriated funds for personal use." David leaned toward me, whispering, "It's doctored. Give me a second." He stood up and addressed the court. "We'd like to cross-verify this evidence before proceeding." The judge allowed it. David plugged in his own drive. The screen shifted again, this time displaying the metadata file we'd recovered from my grandmother's trust documents. The timestamps didn't match. The footage Evelyn presented had been recorded months after I'd left the company on a system already deregistered under her name. David zoomed in on a single line of code. "There it is," he said. "File created by user Evelyn G." The courtroom went silent. Evelyn's lawyer tried to object, but David kept going. "And one more thing." He opened another video, the one from Langley's confession. On the screen, the notary's voice trembled. Mrs. Grant paid me $15,000 to validate forged signatures. She said it was a family matter. Evelyn's composure cracked for the first time. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for a glass of water. Adam leaned forward, whispering something, but she didn't respond. Then David opened the final file, the original Eleanor Trust video I had found in the attic. My grandmother's voice filled the room, frail but steady. If this trust is ever altered without Emily's consent, it is null. She must decide what remains in this family, not anyone else. The air in the courtroom felt heavy, electric. Reporters scribbled furiously, the judge's face unreadable. I looked over at my father. Tears were running down his cheeks. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I let silence destroy us. The judge called for recess, then reconvened after an hour. When she returned, her tone was measured but firm. Based on the presented evidence, this court recognizes the fraudulent manipulation of the Eleanor Trust and illegal transfer of assets. All properties and funds associated with Lawrence and Grant Design are to be seized pending redistribution. Evelyn Grant and Adam Lawrence are to be indicted for fraud and bribery. The words hung in the air, solid and irreversible. My mother didn't look at me. My father bowed his head, shoulders shaking. Adam muttered something under his breath before his lawyer pulled him back. Outside, the media swarm was immediate. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. Someone asked, "Was this revenge?" I stopped on the courthouse steps, the sky breaking open above us with faint sunlight. "I'm not here for revenge," I said quietly. "I'm here because the truth belongs somewhere, and it wasn't with them." David stood a few steps behind me, silent but proud. Reporters shouted more questions, but I kept walking. At the bottom of the steps, I looked back once. Through the courthouse doors, I could still see my mother being escorted away, her perfect mask finally gone. For a second, pity flickered through me, but it passed just as quickly. The wind picked up, carrying the hum of the city around me. For the first time in years, I felt weightless, not because the fight was over, but because I had survived it. And somewhere in that mix of noise and freedom, I knew this wasn't the end. Justice had spoken, but the aftermath had only begun. Spring arrived slowly that year, the kind that lingered on the edge of winter before finally giving in to warmth. Chicago felt different now, softer somehow, as if the city itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. A year had passed since the trial, since the courthouse lights had blinded me as cameras flashed and reporters shouted my name. Life had quieted, but in that quiet, there was meaning. I moved into a small apartment near the Charles River in Boston, close enough to hear the water on windy nights. The city was new, unburdened by the ghosts that still haunted Illinois. David helped me set up the Eleanor Foundation for Business Integrity, named after my grandmother, the woman who had tried to protect me long before I understood why I needed protecting. We started small, one desk, one phone, one client who had been cheated out of her inheritance by her brothers. By the end of the first year, we had 20 active cases, women who carried the same kind of wounds I had once hidden under professionalism and pride. I spent most mornings at the office reviewing paperwork and drinking coffee that was always too strong. David handled the legal side, sharp and methodical, while I managed the outreach programs. We became a rhythm, steady and wordless, working side by side, until the evenings faded into long walks by the river. We never talked about what we were, and maybe we didn't need to. Connection, I had learned, didn't always require labels. Sometimes it just needed truth and shared silence. My father passed away in the fall. Heart failure, the doctor said. It wasn't unexpected, but when I got the call, I still sat down as if the world had tilted. A week later, a letter arrived in handwriting I hadn't seen in years. Inside were 3 sentences. I was wrong. Silence destroys more than it protects. I'm sorry. I folded the letter and kept it in the same drawer as my grandmother's will. Regret couldn't undo the damage, but it was something. Maybe the first honest thing he'd ever given me. My mother was serving her sentence under house arrest in a small nursing facility near Milwaukee. When the verdict came down, she didn't cry. The last time I saw her, she looked out the window and said, It was always about control, not love. I never meant for it to be this way. I didn't answer. Some words don't deserve replies. Lily filed for divorce 2 months after the trial. Adam's name had become a headline, his reputation beyond repair. When she called me, her voice was quieter than I remembered. "I need to see you," she said. "We met at a cafe near the river." She looked older, not in years, but in spirit, stripped of the glitter our parents had wrapped her in. She apologized before she even sat down. "I should have said something, Emily. I knew parts of what they did, but I didn't stop them." I told her the truth. "I don't hate you. I just hope you find a way to be better than them." A few months later, she joined the foundation as a volunteer. Watching her greet new clients, awkward but sincere, felt strange at first, like seeing an old photograph come to life. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about forgetting. It was about no longer letting the past decide who you were. One afternoon, a news crew came to film a feature about the foundation. They set up lights and asked me to sit near the window, the skyline behind me. The interviewer smiled and asked why I had started all this. I told her that families can give life or take it away, and that sometimes the hardest thing isn't losing everything, it's realizing that you can build again without them. She asked what family meant to me now. I thought for a moment and said, "Family isn't blood, it's the people who don't erase you." That night after the crew left, I stood by the window long after the lights dimmed. The city outside buzzed with quiet life. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. The following weekend, I drove north again. The road to Evanston felt different in spring, lined with new leaves and the smell of rain. The house on Orchard Drive had been turned into a community center for the foundation. The paint was fresh, the sign on the gate read, "Eleanor House." Inside, the walls were lined with photographs of the women we had helped. Laughter replaced the silence that used to hang heavy there. I walked out to the backyard where the grass met the lake. The wind was cool and clean. I could almost hear my grandmother's voice telling me to look ahead, not back. The horizon shimmered in the light, endless and forgiving. For years, I'd thought freedom meant winning. But standing there, I understood it differently. Freedom was peace, quiet, and unremarkable. Freedom was not needing them to see me anymore. As I turned to leave, I caught my reflection in the glass door. I didn't look like the woman who once stood on a terrace in a borrowed dress, pretending to belong. I looked like someone who had finally come home. They once called me the help. Maybe they were right. I helped rebuild what they destroyed. I helped turn their cruelty into purpose. The wind picked up off the lake, brushing through my hair, soft and steady, carrying the scent of new beginnings. I smiled and whispered, "Grandma, we did it." If you've ever been written out of your own story, know this, you can always write yourself back in. Tell me, what would you reclaim if no one could stop you?